Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for joining us for the 30th anniversary celebration of the Human Rights Defense Center. I'm sorry that the ongoing pandemic means that we can't gather in person to celebrate this momentous occasion. Nonetheless, we are here in our respective living rooms, dining rooms, bedrooms, or car phones to celebrate this event. And I'm thrilled to be introducing this event, commemorating this milestone and the important and ongoing work that Human Rights Defense Center has been doing over the past 30 years. As many of you know, the Human Rights Defense Center started from a prison cell in Washington State in 1990 by Paul Wright, who was then incarcerated. He and another incarcerated person named Ed Mead started Prison Legal News. They started Prison Legal News so that people in prison and their family members on the outside would not only be informed about the laws, prison policies, lawsuits, and court rulings that could and did affect millions of people and their everyday lives, but as many of you know, prisons not only keep people inside, but they keep information out. This makes Prison Legal News and the work of HRDC all the more vital. Prison Legal News also amplifies the voices and the actions of the people locked into the nation's prison systems. These are voices that, for far too long, have not been heard, even in discussions about criminal justice policy and reforms. We are hearing more of these voices now, thanks to decades of organizing and advocacy by formerly incarcerated people who have demanded nothing about us without us. But back in the 1990s, we weren't hearing those voices very often, if at all. Prison Legal News gave voice, way back then, to those who were most affected, people who are behind bars, and their family members. In the 1990s, when I was a baby abolitionist, and in the early 2000s, when I was researching my first book, Resistance Behind Bars, The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, Prison Legal News was one of the few outlets that constantly and consistently highlighted the voices, experiences, and actions of people behind bars. They were my go-to for what was happening legally in prisons across the nations, at a time when this information was very difficult to find. I won't go into the history of the astounding and amazing feat of not only starting from prison, but growing and sustaining an important publication like Prison Legal News for over 3 decades. I think Paul Wright will tell you more about that history, but I will say that during the 30 years since Prison Legal News started, the United States has gone from incarcerating approximately 1 million people to 2.2 million people. This does not include people who are in immigrant detention, juvenile jails, or military prisons. This is simply the number of people in local jails, state and federal prisons on any given day. And with this boom, the need for the kind of information that HRDC provides remains urgent. And during this pandemic, when information is even more limited, with prison law libraries inaccessible, lawyers aren't able to travel to see their clients, phone access is even more restricted, Prison Legal News is even more important than ever. The price you paid for tonight's ticket covers the cost of one prisoner subscription to Prison Legal News. This means that your ticket will allow the Human Rights Defense Center to send, for free, much needed legal information and reading materials to a person locked behind bars, who might not otherwise have access to this kind of information. They won't know what is happening on the legal landscape, in the court, or even in prisons in the same state, let alone in different states across the nation. This is especially important during a pandemic that has reached epic proportions behind bars. Multiply your ticket cost covering one prisoner subscription by the hundreds of you who have chosen to attend tonight's gala, and that means that hundreds of people behind bars will be getting this crucial information. Keep in mind that as of Thanksgiving, there were 197,659 confirmed cases of COVID in state and federal prisons alone. This does not include COVID cases in jails, immigrant detention, juvenile jails or prisons, or other forms of lockup. By the time this event happens, there might very well be over 200,000 cases in state and federal prisons alone. This means that people behind bars are locked into their cells, often for 23 to 24 hours a day, or they are crowded into overcrowded housing units where they have little to no ability to socially distance. They don't know what their options are or what other options have succeeded in courts around the country. And this makes access to this kind of information crucial and life-saving during this time. I am honored tonight to introduce James Forman Jr. He is currently the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale Law School. Before that, he was a public defender in Washington, D.C., doing the tireless and thankless work of defending adults and children in criminal court, many of whom were Black, many of whom had been hit by systemic oppression such as poverty and racism, and then went on to find the lack of opportunities once they were entangled in the criminal legal system. He then went on to found the Maya Angelou Public Charter School, an alternative school for young people who had dropped out of school and for youth who had previously been arrested. He weaves in these experiences in his first book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. Not only does he detail the day-to-day injustices facing his clients, Black adults and children mostly, who have been disproportionately targeted by tough-on-crime policies, but he also gives us a grounding in how we as a nation got to this point. He critically examines the roles of Black politicians and police chiefs in building the scaffolding of mass incarceration through increasingly punitive laws that targeted Black people, and he also puts these actions, which in hindsight, even some police chiefs acknowledge as misguided and not helpful at all to curbing the violence, in the context of the country's rising violence, particularly in low-income communities of color, and the drive to protect their communities from harm, and that at the same time as they were demanding more police protection and more punitive prison sentences for those who harmed people in their communities, they were also demanding more investment and more resources in Black communities, resources such as jobs, housing, and education, basically what James Forman Jr. calls a Marshall Plan for the Black community. But instead of getting jobs, housing, education, health, and mental health resources, these communities got policing and prisons. If you haven't read Locking Up Our Own, I highly recommend it. And if, in conversations about Black Lives Matter, police violence, and criminal justice reform, anyone asks you, what about Black on Black crime? Give them this book. You can order Locking Up Our Own through the website of Human Rights Defense Center. You can also order both of my books. My first book, Resistance Behind Bars: The Struggles of Incarcerated Women, which looks at the little-known history of resistance and organizing in women's prisons across the country, as well as my latest book, co-authored with Maya Shenwar, editor-in-chief of the news website Truth Out and a long-term supporter of Prison Legal News and HRDC's work, and it's called Prison by Any Other Name: The Harmful Consequences of Popular Reform, which looks at the ways in which popularly proposed alternatives, such as home confinement, electronic monitoring, probation, mandatory drug treatment, and involuntary mental health confinement, all of which are being proposed as solutions to our nation's craze for locking up millions of people, actually instead expand the carceral state into our homes and communities. It is a cautionary lesson, similar to the one that James Forman Jr. outlines in Locking Up Our Own. as to what happens when we look to the carceral system and the police and prison nation to solve our underlying social and political problems. Now, I am honored to present James Foreman Jr. Thank you so much for attending.
Hello and welcome. I want to thank all of you for supporting this remarkable organization and celebrating its 30-year anniversary. I know everybody wishes they could be together in person. I certainly do. But it's good that we're at least able to gather in this imperfect way. If you've joined this call, if you're supporting this organization, it's because you believe in justice, you believe in the humanity of our fellow men and women you who are behind bars, and you want to transform our bloated and brutal criminal system. I don't need to tell you that. So in my time, what I'd like to do is talk to you about some of the things that I think we're going to need to do, some of the ways I think we're going to need to think about this problem if we want to achieve our goals and if we want to make the next 30 years of work look different and be more successful in some ways than the past 30 have been, although there have been some remarkable achievements, and I'll talk about some of those, and you've undoubtedly hearing about some of those on this call. But I want to share 5 principles with you. These are principles that I hope and think can guide our work in this next period of time. And the first principle is the idea of never giving away your power. And this is a lesson that I learned from my mother. I was in 10th grade. I had started at a new high school. And on the first or second day of school, I hadn't learned my way around the school. I was in a bathroom, and I saw something that made me feel uncomfortable. Small group of kids was bullying another kid. It wasn't physical, it was words and taunts, but they hurt. I could see that they hurt. And the kid was being bullied because of how he dressed and walked, and I didn't have the words for it at the time, but now I know it was because of his emerging gender identity and expression. But even then, even though I didn't have the words, I knew it was wrong. And when I got home from school that night, I told my mother about what had happened. Now, my mom had been in the civil rights movement in the 1960s with my father. That's where they met. And my parents were an interracial couple. My dad is black, my mom is white. And they were an interracial couple back when those marriages were illegal in many states in this country. And they were members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they had stood up to racism. They had taken down segregation. They had fought Jim Crow. So my mom knew a thing or two about confronting injustice. So I told her my story, and I was proud of myself because I didn't just have a complaint. I came to my mom with ideas about what could be done. I had ideas for what the principal could do, for what the assistant principal could do. I even had an idea for what my mom could do. My mom was one of those parents who was always up in the school complaining about this or that. Most of the time, like many kids, I didn't want her there. So now I was like, hey, great, Mom, here's something you really can go and complain and raise your voice about. And my mom listened to me carefully, and when she was done, she said, look, I'm glad you told me about this story. I'm glad you felt comfortable sharing with me. And I'm glad you have ideas for what can be done. But she said, James, I have one question for you. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? That was her question for me. So remember, she said to me at the time, she said, you'll have regrets in life and you'll make mistakes, but one thing that you will never, ever regret is the choice that you made to stand up for somebody who needs your support, who needs your help. So what are you going to do about the problem? My mom's message, what my mom was saying to me was, don't give away your own power, right? She was saying if change is going to take place, I had to own my own power, my own ability, my own responsibility to do something in response. And we've seen evidence over these last 30 years, even as bleak as they have been in some ways, in the fact that this system of mass incarceration has been constructed during this time. We've seen some of the evidence of what our power, what our collective power can do. Let's talk about the death penalty. When this organization was founded in 1990, this country typically imposed over 300 death sentences a year. But because of concerted action, lobbying, educational campaigns, litigation, public pressure, because people didn't give away their power, the death penalty has been steadily decreasing. Today, only about 1/10 that number, only about 30 death sentences are imposed each year, and that's too many. Any number greater than 0 is too many. But it's 1/10 of what it was just 30 years ago. We've seen similar success in pushing down the juvenile incarceration rate, the incarceration rate of people under the age of 18. Our juvenile incarceration rate is currently at the lowest level since the federal government began tracking that number in the mid-1990s. Now, those of us who are committed to ending mass incarceration, to creating a fairer, more just system, we don't often talk about these successes. And there's a sense, I think, among a lot of advocates, among progressives, that if we discuss success, we'll lose momentum, that people will stop seeing the issue as urgent, that somehow maybe we're failing those who are still left behind, who are still bearing the brunt of this brutal, massive, this unjust system. And I understand that. I get those concerns. But I also think it's crucial to remember what we've achieved. As long as we're clear, and here's the important part, as long as we're clear that this progress didn't happen by itself. It happened because people organized, because people litigated, because people educated, they voted. It happened in courts and in the streets and at the ballot box. It happened in communities, in city halls, in state houses. It happened because people who care refuse to give up their power, right, to make change. So that's the first principle. But once we've accepted our power, how do we go about making that change? And that brings me to my second principle, which is the importance of building relationships with those who have been most directly harmed by our systems of oppression and our systems of injustice. Much of my life's work has been dedicated to dismantling this system of mass incarceration. And I teach and I write and I give speeches about these issues. But a few years ago, with my mom's voice ringing inside of me, I realized that there was a risk, even for me. It's a risk that Nobel laureate, Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel identified when he was asked, how could the Holocaust ever have occurred? And Wiesel recognized that the answer was complicated, but a piece that he kept coming back to was the risk, he said, of turning people into abstractions. If you turn human beings into abstractions, Wiesel said, you'll end up having no respect for the human being. That's what demagogues do, right? Whether it's the supposed Muslim terrorist or invading immigrant caravan or black criminal or felon prisoner of any race. These abstractions, these labels, are designed to push us toward fear and hate. And even if we don't get all the way towards fear and hate, they can push us towards isolation and indifference. We move away. We look away. We close our minds. We close our hearts. And the only way to resist and overcome that, the only way to avoid turning people into abstractions, the only way to resist our tendency toward indifference is to move towards people, towards relationship, towards community. A few years ago, I was trained by an organization called Inside Out Prison Exchange. These are amazing folks. This is an organization that trains professors how to teach the classes that we normally teach at our home colleges and universities and take them inside prisons. But here's the extra piece. Some of the students from your home university go with you to the prison and you study alongside incarcerated men and women. So I teach a class on the criminal legal system. I used to call it the criminal justice system, but increasingly I've become convinced that a system that offers so little justice doesn't deserve to have the word in the title. And now each semester, I teach the same class that I used to teach at Yale, but we meet inside of a prison. And the class is made up of 10 students from Yale and 10 students who are incarcerated, sitting in a seminar circle, studying the material as equals, as peers. And it's the most powerful teaching that I've ever done. And it's so powerful, right? What makes it so powerful is that we're taking groups that our system, our prisons are designed to keep apart, right? Prisoners who are supposed to have no future and university students who are supposed to be the future. And we're putting those groups together in relationship and dialogue and community. And something powerful comes out of the experience of using the setting of an academic classroom inside of a prison to breach walls and tear down barriers. The RAND Corporation has studied this issue, and they report that for every dollar we spend on education in prison, as a society, we receive $5 in return. And it's because people who have had the chance to go to school while they're incarcerated are more likely to be employed and less likely to commit crime. And a study out of Emory University went into more detail on the impact of education and recidivism. And that study found that while as many as 67%, 2 out of 3, of incarcerated people are rearrested within 3 years of their release, those rates of recidivism go down dramatically when the incarcerated men and women have had a chance to receive an education. So if you complete even some high school classes while you're inside, that lowers the recidivism rate from 67% down to 55%. If you complete vocational training while you're inside, that reduces it down to 30%. If you obtain a bachelor's, an associate's degree, that reduces it down to 14%. If you obtain a bachelor's degree, that recidivism rate goes down to 5%. But those outcomes, those numbers, they're important. But they just scratch the surface of the real change that takes place when you provide education inside of prisons. At the end of one of my first semesters of teaching, I have the students write final evaluations and their self-reflective pieces. And one of the students who was incarcerated, this is what he said in his final evaluation, and I'm quoting here. He said, "I liked the law and the policy that we learned in this class. I did. But most of all, what I liked was that every week when I entered our classroom and saw the other students who had traveled a long way from Yale to sit in this seminar circle, and I saw you, my professor, and I saw my fellow classmates from prison, I knew at that moment that I was entering a place of learning. I was entering a place where I'd be treated like I had something to say, where I'd be treated like I was smart, a place where I would be treated like, and on some days I would even feel like, an intellectual. And the walls and the guards and the culture of this prison tell me the opposite of that every day. But I can use my 2 hours here in this seminar like a coat of armor that helps get me through the rest of the week until I see you again." And that's how he concluded his reflection. Now, I happen to be involved in Inside Out. And if you want to learn more about that program, you can just Google Inside Out Prison Exchange and learn about it and see if there are opportunities available to you. But even if you don't get involved in Inside Out, there are so many other excellent prison education programs that need and want your help. There's not enough, not close to enough, starting with the 1990s when Congress eliminated Pell Grants for incarcerated men and women. But there are a number of volunteer programs that have tried to start up and to meet the need. And on my website, jamesformanjr.com, there's there's a tab called Take Action. And there you will see a list of resources, a list of programs And if you do nothing else after listening to my words, I hope that you'll find a way to look through that list, or Google for your own community, but look through these lists and find a program that is near you and find a way to participate in one of them, and to bring yourself in relationship with men and women who society has tried to throw away, but whose humanity and whose potential is up to us at this event to recognize and to nourish. And each of these programs is a little different. Right? They all have their own niche and their own perspective, but they all provide ways for people to go beyond the walls of the prisons and jails, to use your skills and expertise and just bring your humanity, to bring them inside in a socially meaningful and impactful way, and to learn as well from people who have much to teach you, and to fundamentally break down the stereotypes and the false assumptions that divide us and keep us apart. Prison education is also crucial, I believe, because it's part of this important task of educating the leaders of the next generation of the fight to transform our justice system. For too long, people who have felony convictions, people who have been incarcerated, right? They've been ignored. Their voices have been ignored, silenced in public debates, right? They've been stigmatized and shamed and told to just shut up and go away, even after they're released. Even advocates for change, even those of us that are in the movement for reform and transformation, often sideline the voices of those who are most directly impacted. But a criminal justice reform movement without the voices of people who have been incarcerated, I mean, it's like a civil rights movement without the voices of Black people, or a women's rights movement without the voices of women. We wouldn't and shouldn't and couldn't imagine those. And the same thing in this movement. We shouldn't imagine this movement without those voices. Education helps build people's capacity for leadership. I've seen this in my own work. One of the programs that I've started recently is called the Access to Law School program, and it provides a pathway to law school for New Haven residents. And when we first set up the program, we're actually just in our first year, but when we were first recruiting students for that pilot year, one of the things I said is we have to have students who have been incarcerated. So it may be harder, it might take more work, but we have to get the applications out. And I'm pleased to say that we've been successful. We have about 25% of our initial class has been involved in the justice system or has been incarcerated. And I believe that one day, right, they will go to law school, and that will provide the credential that they need, or one of the credentials they might need to become leaders in this justice reform movement. But all that comes, right? All that is only going to come after you put yourself in relationship and right relationship with those that have been most directly impacted by this system and its harms. So now you put yourself in relationship with those people who have been harmed. When you do that, let me tell you, when you do that, some of your assumptions and some of your preconceptions are going to be challenged. And you might even hear, I predict you will hear, some things that are uncomfortable, some things that you might not even want to hear. Which brings me to my third principle that I'm going to ask us to keep in mind. And that is the importance of being willing to hear the truth and tell the truth, even or especially when it's uncomfortable to do so. And our country is not good at this. We do not have a good track record of being good at this. We have yet to confront our history of racial injustice, racial terror, racial oppression. We either ignore it entirely, as with the genocide of the Native Americans, or we minimize and obscure it, as with the history of slavery and Jim Crow. We teach slavery as a short unit in school, never acknowledging that this brutal legal regime in which a race of people were bought, sold, whipped, and bred for profit existed for most of American history. Right? Just do the math. 1619, when the first black slaves were brought to this country, to 1865 is more years than 1865 to the present. And of course, when slavery ended, instead of reparations, we simply introduced another form of oppression, racial segregation, and terror and Jim Crow. And we obscure the truth about that as well. Right? We suggest that that was a Southern phenomenon, when cities throughout this country, including probably where you live, right, had segregation built into the fabric of their housing, their zoning, their employment, their education, their transportation policies. And this racial subordination, it had very tangible outcomes, right? It meant that black soldiers coming back from fighting Hitler overseas came back only to learn that they couldn't get the benefits of the GI Bill. That was a huge, enormous federal program to support our veterans after World War II, to allow them to get higher education, but which black soldiers were excluded from. It meant that black homeowners looking to buy or improved homes were denied mortgages because of redlining. It meant that black families lost the opportunity to build up wealth over generations. It meant that black communities were bulldozed when the federal highway system was built throughout this country in the 1950s and 1960s. This story is probably true where most of you live, but just to take my hometown in Atlanta, if you've ever driven through Atlanta on I-75 or I-85 as you approach downtown from the north, you're driving through what was once called the Black Wall Street. Right? Auburn Avenue, Martin Luther King was raised there. A thriving black middle-class community decimated by a federal highway run right through its heart. And why was it built there? Why was that community destroyed? Well, because of racism, because black communities had the least clout, so they took the brunt. Now, these are the kind of truths that you're going to need to be aware of, right? When you hear the news, you hear a politician say that community is crime infested or drug ridden, or that a prison is full of people that we should write off, we should ignore, we should degrade. See, they use those labels to encourage you to make assumptions about the people that live there. What kind of people are those? What sort of criminal activities are they up to? Why don't they care about their children? Why don't they care about their communities? But when you're armed with some of these historical truths, you'll be prepared to say, wait a minute, I have some different questions. I don't want to know what kind of people are these. I want to know what kind of people are we. Who did this? I want to know what kind of laws, what kind of policies, what kind of racism created this destruction. And then crucially, what can we do about it? What must we do about it? Including, as my mom would say, never giving away our power. What do I have the power to do about it? Okay, so you didn't give away your power. You're working in relationship with those who have been harmed most directly. You're willing to hear and to tell the truth. But even with that, even having done all of that, the work in front of us is hard, right? What we're talking about is taking down the largest prison system in the history of the world and replacing it with something that protects communities, that allows them to thrive, that protects and recognizes the humanity and potential of every one of us, even those who has harmed others, that gives victims the actual protection and restoration and accountability that so many of them are looking for, not just unending punishment. Well, that is going to be hard, right? That is not an easy task. And so to do it, we're going to need allies. And that brings me to my fourth principle, which is that we need to seek allies wherever we can, including in unlikely places. Now, it won't be news to you that right now that we live in a highly divided time and a highly divided country. We're increasingly sorted by zip code, by friend group, by social network, even by the news that we consume, that we choose to read and we choose to watch. But I believe if we're going to reduce this nation's excessive punishment, we have no choice but to find points of common interest, even with those who right now we might see as hopeless or indifferent, or might not even think about as possible allies. Now, I'm making this pitch about looking for allies in unlikely places, but I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to consider what the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had to say on this topic. So in one of his last sermons, given in February 1968, just a couple months before his death, given from his home pulpit in Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta on Auburn Avenue, Dr. King had some words that I think we should consider for this time. The title of this sermon was The Drum Major Instinct, and I encourage you to go listen, read it, or even better, listen to it if you can. But he was talking about, in this sermon, he was talking about the natural desire, he said, to be in front, to be the leader. And he said that could be used for good or for ill. One of the ways it has been used for ill in our society that he was trying to tackle in this sermon was racism. And here I'll quote Dr. King. He says, "Do you know that a lot of the race problem grows out of the drum major instinct? A need that some people have to feel superior. A need that some people have to feel that they are first, to feel that their white skin ordained them to be first." And then he tells a story about when he was in jail in Birmingham. He says, "The other day, I was in jail, and I always try to do a little converting when I was in jail. And we were in jail in Birmingham, and the white wardens and all the others started coming around. They started coming around our cell to talk about the race problem. And they were showing us why we were so wrong to demonstrate. And they were showing us why segregation was so right. And they were showing us why intermarriage was so wrong. So I would get to preaching," he said, "and we would get to talking. And on the second or third day of talking, they started talking about where they lived. These jailers started talking about how much they were earning. And when those brothers told me how much they were earning, I said, 'Now you know what? You ought to be marching with us. You're just as poor as Negroes.' And I said, 'You're put in a position of supporting your oppressor because through prejudice and blindness you fail to see that the same forces that oppress Negroes in America also oppress poor white people. And all you're living on is the satisfaction of your skin being white and the drum major instinct of thinking that you are somebody big because you're white. And yet you're so poor you can't send your children to school. You ought to be out here marching with us every time we have a march.'" There's a lot that can be said about this passage. But for now, I just want to focus on the point that Dr. King didn't give up on his jailers. Right? Think about it. He had every reason to write them off. They embodied, right? They were the embodiment of the white supremacist segregationist system that was literally incarcerating him for challenging it. Right? But instead of writing them off, he looked for common interest. He looked for allies, even among the very segregationists who were imprisoning him. And I think we should do that today, throughout this movement. In particular, I want to say, we shouldn't be afraid of, and we should look for allies among those who have been victimized or harmed by crime. So much over the last 30 or 40 years, so much bad has been done in the names of crime victims. So much punitive legislation, right? Some of it quite literally bearing their names. And often in conversations about transforming our system, what about the victims, right, are invoked as a rallying cry. But I think we actually have to go a little bit deeper and start to ask ourselves, well, what do people who have been harmed really want? The Alliance for Safety and Justice, an organization that I hope you will spend some time looking at their materials on their website, they have a profound report called Crime Survivors Speak. And it reveals how victims of crime are more likely to be low income, more likely to be young, more likely to be people of color, right? More likely to come from the same groups, that is, that are over incarcerated as well. Victims of crime experience enormous challenges in recovery and in healing. 8 in 10 report experiencing at least one symptom of trauma. And crucially, this report finds that if you give people who have been victimized by crime the choice, as our current system does, right? If you give them the choice of prison or nothing, they overwhelmingly prefer prison, because nobody wants nothing to be done in response to their victimization. But if you give them a wider menu of choices, if you give them options like holding people accountable through restorative justice programs, mental health treatment, both for them as victims and for the person who harmed them, drug treatment, community supervision, community service, overwhelmingly, victims prefer those set of choices to prison. Many victims, especially those in low-income communities, they know that prison and aggressive policing has toxic consequences. They're desperate for other responses to crime that have a better chance of working. So those are examples of some of the allies, some of the alliances, some of the unlikely groups that I think we should begin turning to as we try to build a system to replace and transform the one that so many of us are here to resist and to complain about. So let's say we haven't given up our power. We've worked in right relationship with those who have been most directly affected. We've been willing to confront uncomfortable truths. And we've built alliances in unlikely places. There's one more principle that I want to ask you to hold on to in this fight for justice, this fight for human rights, this fight against mass incarceration. And this fifth and final principle is this: to fight for justice, you must remain hopeful, even when the conditions don't appear to call for it, even when you feel desperately outnumbered. I learned this lesson from my father. I told you all at the beginning a story about my mom, and I want to end by telling you something that I learned from my father. A few years before he died, my dad and I were watching a movie about the civil rights movement. And when it ended, I asked him what he thought about it. He said he liked it. He liked the fact that they showed this history, which was so important, on film, since more people watch movies than read books. I can tell you, now that I'm an author, that he is correct about that. But what he didn't like, he said, what he didn't like was that they made it seem like everybody was in the civil rights movement back then, back in the 1960s. And he said it wasn't like that. We were unpopular, he said. We were few in number. He talked about he used to go to college campuses and try to recruit students to come to Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia to fight segregation, and he'd be run off campus. And now many of those same campuses have elaborate photo displays honoring their alumni who went south. He said even Dr. King, the most revered of all of our civil rights heroes, even he was unpopular when he died. Gallup did a poll, and King had a 2/3 unfavorable rating in the months before he was killed. Even the famous March on Washington, my dad said, was unpopular at the time it happened. There was a poll a couple months before the march And the question was, do you think the planned march in Washington, D.C. will help or hurt the cause of the Negro? And 60% of Americans said they thought it would hurt. Now, there were 250,000 people at that march, right? 250,000. And that's a lot. But my dad said a decade later, 10 million people would say they were there. And my dad said, look, I'm not telling you this because I want credit for being there first. That's not the point of this conversation, he told me. He said, I'm telling you this because I think that the way they tell the history of the civil rights movement is demoralizing for your generation and for future generations. He said, look, in your generation, you have an issue, you call a meeting, you want to do something about it, and only 6 people show up. And 5 of them were at the last meeting. And the activists out there, those of you that are on this call, participating in this, you know what I'm talking about. And then my dad said, you see thousands of people marching in Selma and Montgomery, and you wonder, well, what's wrong with us? What's wrong with my cause? And my dad said, here's the thing. When you are fighting a deep and profound and apparently insurmountable injustice, people are going to tell you that change is impossible. But if you ignore them and you march and you mobilize and you litigate and you educate and you win and you make the change, those same people who told you it was impossible are going to turn around and say, oh, I knew that was going to happen. It was inevitable. And they'll make a movie about it. So I don't know, right, as we gather here 30 years after the founding of this organization and prepare ourselves and gird ourselves for the next period of fight. I don't know what the idea out there for justice, for prisoners' rights, I don't know what idea out there is more profound and more transformative than any I have mentioned. And I don't know what group of people who is participating in this fundraiser, what group of you is going to take that idea and turn it into action. But what I do know is that the idea is there and that the person or people are here. We're part of this call. We're supporting this organization. You're here. And I know this. I know that when you don't give away your power and you work in relationship and in community and you hear and tell uncomfortable truths and you seek allies in unlikely places and you remain hopeful even when there seems little cause for hope, that one day you are going to lead us in overcoming mass incarceration and replacing it with a system that protects and heals and restores community, replacing it with a system that deserves to have the word justice in the title. And when you do that, when you achieve what they said would never happen, they're going to make a movie about you too. And when they do, I'll be sitting there with popcorn in hand, brimming with pride and with gratitude, and I will stand and I will cheer and I will applaud you and all that you have done and achieved. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Paul Wright. I'm the founder and the executive director of the Human Rights Defense Center. And I'd like to thank you for attending our virtual event today on December 10th, which is International Human Rights Day. When I started Prison Legal News in 1990, I was in a maximum security prison cell in Washington State. And another prisoner named Ed Mead, he was my co-editor and founder at the time. Together, we put together our first issue of the magazine. The purpose in publishing Prison Legal News, which later became the Human Rights Defense Center, at that time was to give prisoners a voice. Prisoners and their families were the people who were most impacted by what passed for criminal justice policy in this country, yet they were the people who had the least say and the least voice in those policies. 30 years later, that view has not changed. I see the need more than ever for there to be a voice for people in prison and their families on how prisons are run, what's happening behind them, and everything else related to the human rights of people impacted by the criminal justice system. Why I believe that journalism has a critical role to play in criminal justice reform in this country is, after having been in prison for 3 years at that time in 1990, I thought that if the American public knew what was happening in prisons and jails, and they knew what was happening with their tax dollars in their names, they would be outraged and would demand change. I see the secrecy that prisons and jails operate in. These institutions are the least transparent of all government institutions. The reality is, for most Americans, they know more about what's happening in North Korea than in the local jail a few miles from their homes or businesses or workplaces. And in large part, we've seen the contractions of the media, but the media was never really that interested in reporting on prison and jail issues. And that's what led me to start Prison Legal News. And here we are 30 years later, and those needs are more apparent than ever. Even when we have the internet, we have vast sources of information. Prisons and jails remain incredibly secretive institutions that let very little information out and also don't let information in. Journalists are, for the most part, uniformly forbidden from entering prisons and jails in the United States. There's very little in the way of critical analysis or critical access to prison and jail officials or what's happening inside detention facilities around the country. Prison Legal News has slowly grown. The magazine started out in 1990 with 75 potential subscribers, and it was hand-typed, 10 pages of a newsletter photocopied and stapled together. As we sit here today in 2020, 30 years later, Prison Legal News has over 72 pages of content. We have over 8,000 paid subscribers in all 50 states around the country. And today our website, the prisonlegalnews.org website, receives over 250,000 unique visitors every month, reading our stories, finding out what we have to say about prisons and jails, and reviewing our 30-year database, our chronicle of the misery and the injustice and the brutality of the American criminal justice system and its prisons and jails. In 2017, the Human Rights Defense Center started publishing another magazine, Criminal Legal News. And Criminal Legal News reports on policing, police misconduct, prosecutorial misconduct, as well as criminal law and procedure, and issues such as the death penalty, probation, parole, and that aspect of policing. Between our two publications, the Human Rights Defense Center publishes a complete view of what's happening in the criminal justice system, from policing and prosecution and arrest, all the way through incarceration, conditions of confinement, through parole, probation, and release, and the collateral consequences of a criminal conviction. We've been able to grow from an all-volunteer organization to an organization with 16 employees, with our main office in Florida and offices in Seattle and Washington, D.C., thanks to support from people like you. Through the years, when we originally started, we published Prison Legal News. That was our main advocacy activity. Over the years, we've grown to be able to distribute books that are of interest to prisoners, including self-help and legal reference books. We now publish such books. A lot of the books that we've published include the Habeas Cite book on ineffective assistance of counsel, the Habeas Cite book on prosecutorial misconduct, the Prison Education Guide for prisoners seeking to get an education in prison, and more. As a nonprofit, we're able to publish books and distribute books that commercial publishers do not find commercially viable. Generally, people are not looking at the prisoner market or as prisoners as a population in need of information as a commercially viable one. And that's where we've been able to fill that very real need for the past 30 years. In addition to our publishing and journalism activities, the Human Rights Defense Center's litigation team has been able to leverage our resources quite a bit, and we've been able to litigate cases around the country. Our groundbreaking cases on First Amendment issues challenging prison and jail censorship has literally kind of written the book on this issue. For our 30-year history, prison and jail officials have been almost pathological in their zeal to censor our publications. Between Prison Legal News and Criminal Legal News, many states and dozens of jails around the country have tried everything they can to prevent the prisoners in their custody from reading our publications and seeing what we have to say. They don't want people in captivity to know what their rights are, or even that they have rights, much less enforceable rights. And more importantly, they also don't want the captives in their prisons and jails to read about the corruption, to read about the horrors that are regularly being visited upon those captives. And I think it's worth noting that in 30 years of publishing prison legal news and criminal legal news, no one has ever said that a single story that we have published is untrue or factually inaccurate. Each issue of Prison Legal News is going out to thousands of prisoners around the country. Each issue of Prison Legal News and Criminal Legal News is being read by hundreds of thousands of people online. And for that, we rely on people like you. Your donations make a difference in the work that we're able to do. Throughout our 30-year history, we've never received much in the way of foundation funding. Our source of support is our readers, our subscribers, our advertisers, and people like you who make a difference. It's often been said that if you believe in an independent free press, you should support one. At this point, Prison Legal News is the longest publishing independent prisoner rights publication in American history. And I think as we look around the media landscape, we see so many publications that go under. Most media publications don't even make it into the double digits. At this point, after 30 years, Prison Legal News has published over 360 consecutive monthly issues, which is no mean feat. One of the things that I've seen over the past 30 years is the constants that American prisoners have dealt with. At every level today, as we stand here in the year 2020, so many things are worse for American prisoners than they were when we started. When I started Prison Legal News in 1990, the United States had 1 million prisoners in prisons and jails around the country. By the year 2000, that prison and jail population had doubled to 2 million people. And today, as we sit here 30 years into HRDC's existence, we have 2.5 million people behind bars. And by every measure, the conditions of those people behind bars is far worse than it was in 1990 when we first started. Prisoners are exploited at every level financially in ways that didn't even exist or hadn't been thought of in the year 1990. Overcrowding is endemic around the country. The brutality, the lack of rights and remedies, the restrictions on court access, the restrictions of access to the media, visitation policies, everything in general is far worse now than it was before. I can say that my career as a prisoner rights activist for the past 30 years has probably been characterized as a long retreat. As bad as things are, I wonder how bad would they have been if we hadn't been advocating, if we hadn't been fighting, if we hadn't been doing the best we could to make things better than they are. Among the things that the Human Rights Defense Center has been able to do as part of our advocacy, we've been able to run very successful campaigns. Our Prison Phone Justice campaign has got the Federal Communications Commission to significantly reduce the cost of phone calls for prisoners around the country. Our Prison Ecology Project has brought public attention and media attention and highlighted the intersection between the environment and environmental degradation and mass incarceration around the country. And we've been prime opponents of the private prison industry as well. And all told, I have to say that, HRDC has made an impact at every level around the country. But more importantly, the critical thing we've done is we have given prisoners and their advocates timely, reliable information that they can use to advocate for themselves and to help themselves. And we've also spread the notion that people can fight for themselves, people can stand up for themselves, and sometimes actually win and make things better. Throughout the past 30 years, I've always characterized HRDC as the organization that makes a difference in people's lives. We make that thanks to the efforts of HRDC and our litigation team. Over 800,000 prisoners around the country, from California to Maryland, from Washington State to Florida, are getting things in the mail that they otherwise would not be getting. That's a real difference. That's a real impact. A few years ago, we sued the local jail in Palm Beach County, which was holding children in solitary confinement and not allowing them access to an education. After our legal team was done with them, the county was no longer holding children in solitary confinement, and all children in the jail were receiving an education. So these are the real things that we're able to do that actually make a difference, have an impact, and change how people are treated in the vast American criminal justice system. For the past 30 years, I'd like to thank everyone who has made this possible. This includes the subscribers who've paid to subscribe to our magazine, our advertisers, our donors, the dozens of lawyers around the country that have fought hard to ensure that prisoners can actually receive our magazines and our books, our board members, and everyone else. And without everyone's work and effort and support, we would not be where we are today, 30 years later. If you can make a donation to support the Human Rights Defense Center and the work we're doing, I hope you can do it now. Please consider becoming a monthly sustainer. And we're a lean organization. Every penny you donate goes towards criminal justice reform. We don't do anything else but criminal justice reform. This is it. Normally, I would say if you're ever in South Florida, feel free to come by the office and visit us. Due to the pandemic, that's not possible. But feel free to reach out by email or by Zoom. And if you got any questions about what the Human Rights Defense Center is doing, look at our annual report, check out our website, or contact me. We're always happy to hear from our friends and supporters. I'd like to wish everyone a happy holiday season and the best wishes for a new year. And hopefully we'll have the COVID pandemic behind us in the near future. Thank you very much.